Hello everyone, today we talk about pastime and scaffolds in medieval university communities. We often talk about medieval universities even recently from the civilized side of the story, the impact in the history of thought, of cultural production. But there are naturally certain aspects that are not less important in this sense and that could even be framed not maybe in a wholly positive side of the story that concerns specifically the communities of not just of students, but broadly speaking, the life style of the time, right? That explain fundamentally the humus from which these people came from, why they started, why sometimes they decided to leave their homes, going to study in another country. Medieval times, people did travel. At least those who did traveled actually a lot in ways that considered it was also relatively less in the world. But definitely the reason for abandoning your homeland, going to learn a specific craft, to learn theology in Paris or law in Bologna was a big deal, and that is confirmed naturally by the success of these institutions that eventually spread all over Europe, but fundamentally are also concentrated in this specific centers that were dynamic, right, conflictual, and very often here we're looking at places that were the heart of important also political realities that made war, that objectively were very cynetic in their own expression, and therefore there is this pair of always in human history, we could say, of civilization from one side, but also violence proper from another, that are a bit the two sides of the same reality that couldn't perhaps exist one without the other. So naturally there is a positive value of violence as much as a negative. Today I would like to stress also the latter as much we are looking at societies that we don't have to idealize by the least, right? Today I was searching for pictures, some of which you can already see here, of what would be medieval Clockwork Orange, right? Of ultra violence projected in these medieval communities. Now we'll talk about it. And while searching for this stuff on Google, I have to search naturally for certain keywords, and I can't help but read the titles under which these images pop out from. And there were questions like, they're kind of tender in their naivety, like was were people in medieval times more violent than we were, or was there how often were women raped in the Middle Age, how often were all these questions that I don't know if you have ever just studied, I don't know, a pre-industrial society. Can even be by the 18th century, right? Can be by the 17th century. Do you think we do not know what these realities were? Do you think we do not know that these were essentially abusive realities, that people were constantly immersed in a spiral of whirlwind of continuous violence, of abuses, of any psychophysical aspect we could imagine, that this familial context were pretty badly messed up, promiscuity, incest, misery of any kind, right? So we don't have to be surprised here, even talking about Goliardy, that historically has always been associated to camaraderie and mostly to young men, that, as we all know, also have a role in civilization in spite of their violence, or maybe exactly because of their violence, right? Today we look at the world in terms that, in my opinion, are becoming, at least in terms of political rhetoric, ever less understandable. That is to say, biology, psychology tells us something that shouldn't surprise anyone, that, for example, the peak of male creativity is also the peak of male violence and crime. But this is pretty well known, and in any society that you can study. I mean, the fact that we are surprised today by such a thing is literally admitting that you do not know anything, and I stress anything, of the world, present and past, by any standard. What do you think humans are like? What do you think? Why do you think humans are like that? Unfortunately, culturalism is spreading in a disgusting way. At the point we are denying any form of biological, evidence that science keeps, actually impressively expanding on, telling us ever more precise things. They're not even so complex to understand. I mean, they are complex, of course, where they naturally overlap with more technical, precise aspects. But altogether, they tell us a picture that you can. I think you should be aware of if you at least have ever studied, history of art, of religion, of literature. I mean, it's the philosophy of mankind. We all know who we are, in a way or another. It's not that sin or damnation are the weird, invention of a strange repressive cult from the Near East that now doesn't find place in the modern rational reality, right? This is, first of all, a pretty universal message in all philosophies and religions all across the world, with a striking, in fact, universalistic and humanistic, even I would say, and as far as at least the solution is perspective dimension. But already, I banally read and translate the World Funkriege on this channel, and already if you're acquainted to the highest peaks of 18th and 19th century philosophy of European culture, I mean, you know what are the connections between politics, violence, society. I mean, where are the children that today are even taught anything like that? They are basically masked or even upset by this idea that there are the evil people and there are the saints, right? In reality, this will produce unavoidably a schizophrenic approach to reality. Will create actually much more, let's say in brackets, evil people than actually telling the truth of who we really are. And this has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that we should discipline ourselves, that there is a rationality, there is a specific path that we have to attain. But even in here, very often we must give that there is no such thing like discipline or rationality without having passed through certain things, right? That's why it is normal by a certain standard that violence, independently from what society, manages to counter or thinks it is good or bad to, and usually it succeeds in doing it. But this is exactly the point. I mean, it's always there, right? It functions like as an initiatic rite, as essentially a checker, right? A filter. That is, if you're so tough you can bear that, as a victim, you can't maintain that as a guard, right? And avoiding that, this will be done excessively, or but it is actually a very dark view of the world, because it brings us back to Plato said, we will guard the guardians, right? But this is exactly what the principle of individuality and responsibility that is also stressed by every philosophy or religion in this regard, aside certain ones that are in fact not very successful and mostly belong to the fringe, very often the most radically and senselessly violent of society, tells us you have to grow up to know that certain things are always on the table, and it is the intelligence and the capacity and the cold blood and the understanding of a person that makes the world go on, right? Unfortunately, a very dark world. And reality, we could extend this, right? I like to sometimes to make this philosophical reflection. I mean, philosophical, I'm, just for etymologically meant. I thought of starting a series on history of philosophy. I think it would be interesting. But we have to start from this. I mean, I can tell you as a channel fundamentally based on military history that this is a very important aspect, especially this one we discussed today, the Goliards. That maybe are such a bit more of the literary current of it and studied for this, but properly violence among university students is a very big historiographical topic, at least within the boundaries of medieval studies, of at least medieval universities and so on. It's an important part that we can also fortunately document, because universities are born in contexts where finally we get also some other important information about the rest of reality, and that therefore we can trace also a realistic picture of. And always consider that when you think about medieval universities, I presume you feel it's like modern university, the sense of the glory of the institution, but think that these were worlds from in low Middle Ages that were still deeply permeated in contemporary, in the same cities where universities were, by things like, I don't know, the idea of the militia, of knighthood, of essentially societies that were just by this point starting to get a bit the bases that otherwise don't exist, of something like public authority, of a statal system, right? And the prevailing ethos was actually the warrior one in many ways. I mean, knights were essentially that, already naturally disciplined and surely developed in also in terms of rationale and organization. But just to make an example, some of these studia, for example, were famously associated to knighthood in a way. For example, the jurists very often were knighted by the local communities, because they said these people are so important, they're so capable and cultured and useful, also literally in making a lot of money coming to the community, that they have the same importance as knights, so the people that basically ruled society. And knights is also about a lot of initiatic rites, right? We could even parallel in this sense the law student that arrives in Bologna to become eventually a master, and therefore also a doctor eventually proper of in a knight in that regard, as someone that had to pass through an insanely brutal and abusive and traumatic initiatic rite. We can say as much as a squire, a young knight to be did in parallel in the military context, that, as we know, was something absolutely vicious and, just from modern psychiatric standards, something, incredibly devastating. But I would like to stress a little bit this aspect. Of course, university students didn't go through anything like it could be a nightly training. But if you look at the context in which this thing happened, you realize that you see, we are used today to live in a world where there is an authority, right? We live with the certainty in a way that someone, even if we suffer some misdeeds, some violence, someone carries out a crime, etc. You can at least go to the police, that there is a judiciary, that there is someone who works constantly for that to be enforced. Our states are also pretty damn powerful. You can't go out in the street shooting and killing without, nothing happening. Medieval Europe was something very different, right? And societies, as we were saying now, were just starting, in a way or another, to give each other a discipline in this regard. And therefore, we don't have to be surprised that objectively, even just going to study in another country in Europe, or even just, in your own, could be actually a very dangerous thing, right? Just think about traveling, how dangerous it was, generally speaking. But just think about what life, as a common rule, actually was at the point. Also, we're talking about specific individuals. Naturally, not everybody went to study university. These were kind of elites, right? But also lay elites. So they were already expression of a importantly civilized context. So here we're talking mostly about sons of merchants, or even other sons of lawyers and notaries, or other people with important education, maybe even just from a literary point of view, of real scholars, thinkers at this time are also still very much inserted in the political reality of the time. So this already tells you by itself the degree of potential conflictuality altogether that such an experience could entail. And there is also beautiful literature about this all, right? I can think of Petrarch, for example, when he went, so the founder of humanism recognizes such. He went, he was sent by his father, because this was the usual thing, together with his brother, to study in Bologna. And he didn't like that, right? Because he to study law, obviously, in there, and he liked letters in a different way. He would become naturally one of the greatest poets and writers in European history. But he remembered eventually in his own. So when his father died, he came out of Bologna and he went doing whatever he liked. But there is an interesting passage from the Canzoniere, if I'm not wrong, where he thinks about his brother. Petrarch was a bit of a tormented soul. He was, an introvert, sensitive, but also he had his own life. Actually, he had full of, illegitimate sons all together across Italy, France, wherever he went, and there is a beautiful metaphorical, allegorical passage where he lived in France, in Provence, when he worked for the popes in Avignon. Where he says that he went basically either imagine it or really happening with his brother much later when they were adults, now well mature actually adults, climbing this mountain, right? And he makes this parallelism between his brother that patiently determinedly starts climbing the mountain, and he's too lazy, remains down. And that it's naturally more a parallelism, and in that occasion he remembers how his brother in Bologna was very hot-headed as a student. He, as we'll see now, what happened in these realities, and Petrarch was really not. He already at the time he had some moral conscience, but now that they were adults, his brother had redeemed himself, and in fact he would enter a monastery, become a very pious man. And in this poem, he reflects the fact that his brother per aspera ad astra, basically. He went from perdition to salvation evidently, while he had not unbalanced himself so much. After all, had been content of having remained distant from certain vices, but at the end of the day, he hadn't accomplished that great much, morally speaking, also in his life. So there is this important reflection on the value of lowering your your status in order to really get the meaning, to sin fundamentally, in order to be redeemed, which, as you know, in Christian terms is actually better, right? As the parable of the prodigal son, for example, explains, than actually the perfect believer that never sins, and therefore, however, wants something, a recognition for it, right? It's said it's better to sin, to really understand the mistake and to repent, and there is a renewal, like a new life. So this is a very important theme in Christian literature, naturally, and not only. And I don't know, it's expressed also by Dante. Think about the journey in hell and through the purgatory to the heavens, and that also reflects naturally an interior journey that was for Christians at the time, the low Middle Ages, a bit what the entire life was about. The journey, the peregrinatio. We discussed this about about crusades, right? And what's the true meaning of that journey? And surely, if you think even about education today, that's exactly what it is, right? Obviously, we don't understand what it means, like to be a medieval university student, but at the same time, we can understand what the growth, the personal growth that. Not just studying, right? But all that entails, even just as a life choice, and all the things you have to do even to succeed, to get there, right? That involve, a sentimental education, violence, even mistakes, biases, right? Things that sometimes we don't even, can't even be proud of, but that all make us grow along the way. And this is exactly what I think the meaning of university at the end of the day is. It's never the naked knowledge of it. It's all what it takes to get it, and that has a cost, and this cost is indeed dearly paid in many ways. So the life of the medieval student wasn't naturally limited to the attendance of classes. On this also we're not dramatically documented. These classes costed a lot, right? So it was not the students' interest to skip them. In a way, these were all private systems, nor just studying. Consider that these people had to learn by heart Justinian collection, right? They had to know all the glosses, the studying of the glosses, all this enormous amount actually of texts written by different authors. It was a very complex thing. Exams were also very, very intense in that regard, so it was really a hard thing. It probably stressed these people out, as we can imagine, but the socio-economical reward was pretty damn high, right? These people could really be enormously successful had they completed their course. So the good financial resources combined with the young and troubled age, and especially the total lack of familiar or environmental controls rendered the students particularly burst to entertainment of more or less licit nature. This is something you could even see today, right? I don't know about you, but for example, I never liked Erasmus, right? I'd never done it, especially some of the people who I appreciate the most among my colleagues is those who haven't done it. If they were to research abroad for specific reasons, they did it, but let's be honest about it. Higher education is becoming ridiculous all over the West. It's something utterly disgusting. It's just a sexual vacation, and for that, I can't even pay privately. It's not really that I have to involve, lack a good opportunity of learning something. Universities are ridiculous, right? I don't know, in Europe they're ridiculous. I can tell you as a European. I imagine in the rest, like North America, they're even, possibly even worse. It's something, we're sinking to a very low bottom. The people of those times actually studied together with something else, and it was a very serious thing, and the parents paid a fortune. There is no comparison in proportion with the accessibility to learning at the time, but even up to 100 years ago, than there is today. Today it's ridiculous. Everybody can learn, right? Even without, or without, I don't know, going abroad or whatever. It's all a click away, and all it takes is self-control, discipline, determination, which are all the elements that are lacking dramatically, and for which also the educational standards are sinking. Because if teachers, as I see, all the young kids that are come to make exams at university there, they don't know anything in block, right? Compared to how people used to be educated just 50 years ago. What are the standards? Do you actually block them all, right? You don't make them pass. Well, that's a problem. Also, generationally speaking, those kids one day are going to become the next teacher. So there are important changes in that regard. But let's keep contemporary reality aside for a moment. So the epicenter of all the pastime, also, simple chess playing that, for example, at the time was very, very famous, was the tavern, right? A place where you could eat, drink in company, chat, singing, playing dice, or other types of gambling. So on the video on the Goliards, we explained also the broader, influence of this popular environment over higher education. I mean, specifically the contact of of these students with reality that were now increasingly more secular and more diverse. The importance of the city, for example, here as the place as a very different world, the very very heterogeneous world where what the majority of the people lived in. So begins to stimulate also the broader the malice, but also the development of this the new way of thinking. And the tavern as an habitual meeting place was also, and obviously, the place of frequent brawls, and which is a constant in the students' custom, right? As it was the gambling den, that is, the place deputed by local authorities to gambling, right? Or public baths, right? That were, after all, binding necessity, or the true and proper brothels. This side is important because naturally prostitution has always existed in civilization, but specifically even for example public baths, right? Contrarily to what is commonly believed, actually medieval people did clean themselves even more often than we think. Public baths have always existed since the early Middle Age. I mean, that tradition never came out, right? We had to stress mostly the fact that in ancient times everybody went bathing, right? Everyone, what does it mean? Like 1/10 of the population lived in the city, and do you think that each and every person that lived in the city went bathing? And do you think that bathing, even in terme, or was something hygienic, or that it was a big deal? Yeah, it was important. I mean, having current water all together, even just in the streets with aqueducts and so on. Medieval cities are different structurally. It's not that they are necessarily dirtier because they life was worse as a consequence. Medieval cities, especially at this time, are dramatically more populated, for example, and dynamic and scenic than the one of the ancient world. Baths did exist. People did bath, did clean themselves. Just the rest of the if you talk about the peasantry, right? Sometimes we look at the ancient world as everybody was a citizen living in a city. Almost everybody was basically a peasant. In that case, also they cleaned themselves in part, but also was just the misery of the life they carried out that maybe didn't, in certain circumstances, allow them or may render it even necessary to do it. But generally speaking, it's not that humans all of a sudden, what happened in 476 AD, let's all stop bathing. Because before we did it, but now, I feel like we don't, right? This is actually not true. Let's face the fact that pre-industrial societies are largely homogeneous, and that the ancient world and the medieval world as such never existed. It's a pure convention. There is no intrinsic meaning of any sort of either an ancient world or a medieval world. They never existed, notoriously. But in general, the recreation, these meeting places, the activities had always been there in one way or another, including naturally prostitution, given that also all these these were all male students, right? There were also women learning and even teaching sometimes, but it wasn't much it could be it was rare indeed, but it could be frequent even rather in earlier times than these ones, because especially in cities, in these social, economical realities, we know that also from a juridical point of view, that's when women start, losing actually properly, certain freedoms they had usually enjoyed since late Roman times, or even in early medieval times, because society was simpler, so the role of women was more prominent. Instead, with the creation of guilds, of corporations, and so on, in the very late Middle Ages, you can find, there was a guild of women in Flanders, I don't know where, but, overwhelming, Europe was homogeneous in this regard. Women were left out. I mean, law basically began to penalize them, to be excluded in great part from, for example, inheritance as they had enjoyed it, right? Women had never been free in that regard, but here paradoxically, it's not that with the broader improvement of society, I mean, with women went better, right? No, it didn't happen like that. It happened in absolute terms, meaning that, yeah, life quality was higher, but in terms of social restrictions, these were exactly the centuries where the exclusion began to be also more intense. So these were largely all male students, and it's obvious that as far as sexual recreation was involved, the prostitutes population had to correspond. And also, naturally, this is very important because the universities were an enormous business all by themselves. As we'll see now, there were huge problems actually of calling all these young men in the cities to know what, right? And creating a lot of confusion and trouble, sometimes even revolting, destroying, killing, raping. We'll see it. But at the same time, they paid, right? These were, the gentry of Europe in a way, right? They paid, right? They had the money. So this was all cash that the local authorities got in the process. So it was always like tolerating them rather than as far as they paid enough, right? But things could also turn also worse. And against the too assiduous frequentation of these meeting and entertainment places thundered the preachers, but were also very worried the relatives of the students. There is a letter from a broken father that says, it has deeply wounded me with pain, knowing from public voice, this is also fascinating, that many have eventually and unfortunately confirmed that you, the son, abandoned the literary studies from which we were expecting satisfaction and honors. You turply spend your nights and days in the brothels with the prostitutes, right? And you have to imagine, broadly speaking, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, the psychological background of these persons. Maybe think about these were repressive societies in many ways. I mean, we know that they were less regulated than our own, but these were also the same centuries of, I don't know, this mystical crisis of this pauperistic evangelic movements, of this sense of the contrast between, in fact, the earthly pleasures of money, sex, luxury, right, that were, especially the aristocracy, also the oligarchic elements, the merchants, etc., were finally starting to have also in mass, and importantly in different measure compared to the rest of the populace. And think about the psychological crisis of someone that also was, or maybe that had lived, I don't know, in an isolated place and never seen the world, and arrives in this great cities like Bologna, like the Italian ones, and it were something completely unknown. Nobody had ever seen anything like that before, and they would lose it, right? They would start having crises. Can't think. We don't have much of a literature of the misery of this disasters, but if you just read the history of the 12th to 13th century, you know what the broader social agitations were, the heterogeneity of these movements in terms of composition, etc. And we can think, broadly speaking, that even the research for knowledge, the familiar pressure, right? How many people still today break because they are imposed from their family to be that, to be always successful, to be always the best one, to have the the greatest job, the highest income, and they fail because not everybody can arrive to do that, and they are destroyed because they fail everything they thought they were promised to become, right? However, it's especially against gambling. It was considered the potentially more costly vice, and in fact, at the point of reducing a few time to misery, the the most ill-equipped, let's say the poorest of these students, that the parents were, angered. In a model of vernacular letter written at the end of the 13th century, we see a father, a certain Martin from Genoa, writing to his son, student in Bologna, quote, my heart is very is very hurt by your great craziness, right? Which you use basically abandoning what you should be doing with the studying, because I firmly heard that you do not spend time but in gambling, in dice playing, in dishonest places, and that you visit frequently, and for which if you spend too much time in this works rather than studying, as you are supposed to, right? You're supposed to know that you will be deprived by any benefit of mine, this was his father, and of any of my grace, knowing that for all the fictitious letters, and that through all the fictitious letters you will not be able to trick me, right? So consider this. Right? These were meant, and as we were saying, it costed to maintain a son abroad, let's say, for years. It was literally a logistical cost, and even if these were, I don't know, successful merchants or whatever, it was still an important investment. So aside naturally from the paternal love that you can imagine, but specifically here there is the problem, you can't control this person, right? Even with the means of the time, right? Here it's interesting also the reference to the fake letters, right? Meaning that literally, especially merchants that traveled a lot, they started having different seats in various cities. Probably knew each other, they wrote each other. Maybe, I don't know, there was a colleague there that saw the son of this merchant that could tell him what to do. So they were spied despite each other. The word naturally was even more little at the time after all. But so this is just for saying how important it was just to control the work of these students. And the local ruling classes faked to disinterest themselves for such matters, but they tried to maintain constantly the situation under control. As we said before, if anything, for the often the common, let's say, repercussions on public order. There was even such as in Siena in 1422, supported the cause of fixing a ceiling price at least in one of the brothels for the students specifically, both to reduce the dangers of sodomy, that we will see later better what it means in a medieval context differently from today's, both because, quote, the students, as it's notorious, are young and they can't, their blood boiling had that continence that they would have if they had it in a more mature age, right? So biological urges never change, even just by age. By sodomy, we can say it even now. It's specifically any kind of sexual excess, right? For medieval Christian standards. Also, sodomy was often an accusation moved to political rivals, right? It was standard medieval propaganda. So you read sodomy, that not necessarily mean, for example, I don't know, gay, behavior. Granted, that's broadly meant. Just even in here, sodomy is even accepted if you read the quote in as much as said, these are young men, they need to vent themselves because they're not like mature, and so it was broadly speaking in a in otherwise continent society, because let's be honest about this. I mean, if we were to, at the beginning we pictured the idea of course a dramatically abusive society, promiscuous one, of course, right? But this, generally speaking, also was true in the less regulated. I mean, if you look at the peasantry, we know these things happen. But as far as I know, as the fact the urban classes were concerned, well, this was a bit different because there was much greater political and social reputation to maintain. And generally speaking, customs were very harsh in a way, right? We had to think even of levels of sexuality like having sex with clothes on, right? Having this sense of decency of dinner. This is something that existed since ancient times. Unfortunately, even about these topics, there is a few interest, a few curiosity, and a few honesty, I must say, because usually who talks about this topic usually does it from an ideological standpoint to say, oh, look, that society was corrupted, were immoral. Oh, look, I found this passage that this author said that those peoples made orgies, and therefore it doesn't work like that. That's a standard political propaganda. But as far as we know about, generally speaking, these broader words, the middle classes were very prudent in many ways. Then, of course, they did what they had to do, also illicitly for those times. But there was still, however, a very important, imposing sense of decency that in this case also, created problems, as we will see now, when it was infringed. Also, let's speak of violence specifically, because we know that this was widespread at many levels. In fact, aside from pastime, the students usually got into trouble in this sense, in brawls, scuffles, violence of different time, and doing sometimes very serious stunts, such as, for example, raping girls or kidnapping them, even literally sometimes gang raping. We know it existed, as always, unfortunately, and causing the more than understandable and violent reaction in the population. I mean, in the Middle Ages, these things happened. We know of people even eating each other, right, for, skinning each other alive. It was by a certain standard normal to repay with violence a committed violence. And so it happened, for example, in Oxford in 1209, which procured the closing of the studium for 5 years. This also happened in Paris in 1229 and in Bologna in 1321. So we're talking about the highest centers of European learning to be hit by such scandals that often, escalated in violence also on a large scale. But it could naturally happen that to remain hurt or killed was a student, right? A thing that provoked frequently the exodus of all the students from the city, with enormous economical damage for the entire city economy. This also often happened on the base of nations, that we'll see in a while. I mean, the fact that normally students were separated in national guilds, and that often also fought against each other. And from systematic inquiry of all the judiciary acts relative to Bologna for the years that go from 1280 to 1350, we can spot 618 trials that saw these students accused of some kind of violation. The majority of these, 61%, are violations against person, insults, threats, blows, wounds, homicides, and even a defenestration. It would be long to list all the single episodes, but we remember here just one in 1294, when a host was killed by a German student that was discovered in intimity with his own wife. Particularly numerous were the brawls between students and citizens, but especially between students belonging to different nationalities, as we were saying before. And here, from Jacques de Vitry, we get an interesting set of stereotypes about the various naciones. He first of all says that this classical quote that describes the permanent tensions between students, that according to Jacques are always ready to pass de verbis ad verbera, which means from words to action, and quote, they quarreled and fought, not only because of the different disciplines that they studied, this is interesting, and even more for some topic of discussion. You can imagine that, even certain philosophical or theological questions, we know that it caused enormous tensions. Also, because they reflected on the political spectrum, everything was very political, like in a way, like today, or if you think about the 60s or the 70s, back in the day, the violence in the universities, the occupations, the strikes, and so on. And also the differences among various nationalities were cause of dissent. The hates, the virulent hatred, and they let each other go with impotence to every sort of insults and, let's say, affronts, let's say, reciprocally. They said, and this is the fascinating thing, that the English were drunkards and that they had the tail. This thing that the English had the tail, it was something still, in the Renaissance, apparently. In that case, for the Spanish, as far as I remember. Here it says also that the French were haughty, effeminated, and clothed as women, right, cared as women. They said that the Germans were ferocious and beast-like in their banquets, right? This is very much still the Taciturn memory of the Germans assassinating regularly each other during the banquets, maybe when they had drank rather too much. The Normans, here it means I think here it really means the Normans of Normandy, because it starts the list of the French regions, as it was a French, and at the time France was different nations altogether, as you know. The Normans were vain and arrogant. The ones of Poitou were traitors and adventurers always. The Burgundians were considered stupid and vulgar. The Bretons had fame of inconstant and unstable. The Lombards were defined to be stinging, vicious, and vulgar. The Romans to be rabble-rousing, turbulent, and slanderers. The Flemish inconstant, gluttonous, and weak as butter and indolent. And after such similar insults from the words, they often pass to facts. So this is a pretty good setting of most of Western European nationalities, basically negatively styled, and these are the actual voices that were the actual prejudices that were spread at the time regarding to this various peoples. Among the crimes against patrimony, about the inquiry of Bologna, 32% was the most frequent. Was the stealing of books as a cause. So this is also a very important aspect, because books costed an enormous lot. Right, this is a time in Europe where paper is fundamentally being introduced, and especially as far as this studying books, they would be ever more employed, so they would become cheaper. But there was also still in parchment a lot of them, and it was all a system of literally copying the books. So it wasn't just the fact that the books were costly, but also that someone had to write them, had to be pertinent, that the books that were copied from the ones of the masters that gave a certified copy to the bookshops that made all these copies eventually in turn. Also, these bookshops were the only ones who could make the copies, so some were just rented because the manuscripts altogether sometimes were huge. So it's actually very interesting to study even the economical side of it, because there was a great business, as you can imagine, around this stuff, as there still is around publications and so on. Things have not changed dramatically, but stealing books was a big deal because it was really a lot of money, and you can imagine in all this violent context how frequent actually the case would be. But there were also uglier, let's say, crimes against morals, and in fact we know that were unfortunately not rare the attempts of raping towards the sons and wives of the Bolognese citizens. Scarcely documented, in spite Dante, for example, talked about, and also in his commentators, the cases of sodomy, as we were saying before, and strangely, almost completely absent, maybe for a certain tolerance from the side of public authorities, were the infractions to the prohibitions to bear arms and to play dice out of the authorized dens. And the same can be said about the cases of drunk and disorderly, or for mistreating of the serfs and the prostitutes. But we can think that even in on this minor violations, the commune tolerated the jurisdiction of the student tribunal that was actually held by the rectors. This is important because, as you know, we said it many times, at a certain point, especially the University of Bologna was under another jurisdiction from the one of the commune. At a certain point even became papal, but already Frederick Barbarossa had provided the students with their own privilege, and so we know less about how things worked internally, and we don't have to think that they necessarily closed eyes simply because they made justice within themselves. Also because they had specifically this relation with the local authorities to maintain. In conclusion, we could say that in the university cities, students didn't find just schools and professors, and they put only the premises for the ensuing brilliant and remunerative careers, but also they found a true and proper training of life, a school of life. They would have come back from it once concluded their cycle of studying with a treasure of human and social experiences that altogether would have been as valid, perhaps, as that complex of highly technical and professional notions that university also at the time was capable of providing. So maybe we'll come back at some point on the same topic, because we really get also very, very unpleasant stories, right? We have seen also a lot of violence against the serfs, the prostitutes, the local women altogether. That's an important issue, right? That really tells you how those societies concretely were, and it really makes you reflect, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, about those this bright and dark reality at the same time of the centers of higher learning, and that were literally laying the basis for Western think about scholasticism at this time, but also literally the worldview. I mean, the science, social regulation, and so on, that is to be understood as an important accomplishment that had a cost, though, and had also that was done by through mistakes as well. I mean, nobody had this experience before. Like, no civilization had began to reason the way Europeans began to do in universities starting from the 11th to the 12th century, and defining literally a a specific orthodoxy in the world with that specific unity of intent and universalistic vision and attention towards all disciplines. And very often, this is really what makes a difference, was guided by an autonomous learning, right? There wasn't much of a rigid orthodoxy yet, right? The Saint scholasticism is the reflection of this. It's, if you want, the failure of the attempt to stem the teaching of Aristotle by the early Christian authorities that were mostly, Neoplatonic in the basis, and instead there is the acceptance that Aristotle was started being studied by people freely on their own, had to become the base of the next vision of the world, the Ptolemaic Aristotelic system. And so this is an important degree of fluidity that you don't find in other societies altogether. I don't know, in Islam you have genial thinkers, you have individuals, especially coming from very often this less regulated, even sometimes fringe areas, like also from Persia, from even the boundaries of the steppes, that wrote think about all the same scholars on which, after all, European scholasticism was based. It was those ones, right? But paradoxically, they had possibly more impact in opening new horizons in those societies than in their own, because there they didn't meet the same level of dynamism and of liberty, of autonomy that was given to thinkers, to scholars in Europe, right? For reasons that were not, there was always an orthodoxy that had a wish to block everything, but the same political and social relations didn't allow it to happen. And we're always talking about the same elites often, right? Not because, the terrible elites that want to prevent the poor, angelic, average person to accomplish something. It was mostly an elite that carried out this great reform, and that also to be considered. The very elite, the very Christian elite, right? The very papacy did that, ordered that, had the vision, the capacity of seeing it. You don't find it in any other monotheism at that level, right? Well, there are just two essentially, but Judaism actually made important paths, right? The 13th the 13th century is a moment in which actually Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all together produce an astonishing amount of stuff, right? But as we know, on the long run, especially the non-European realities tended to crystallize, right, towards the Renaissance, the modern age. There was a difficult to keep up in most of these with the development, and most of this dynamic past also through certain premises that were laid in the Middle Ages, where things were more different than they're often perceived. But this is a completely different topic that we'll discuss at another time. And I think, however, it's worth reflecting on it, right? So there is always a different, let's say, a cost for civilization. Civilization requires responsibility and intelligence altogether. It's not something you can have by chance, by a function, by an algorithm. It's something you have to humanly take care of at every single moment, right? And that's what we are losing. Those people back in the day had it. We are losing that now, right? We are losing, in my opinion, the capacity to have new thinkers that can propose a universal view, let's say, generally speaking, a new common goal. We are all sectorializing ourselves in entering in mindsets that do not help to come out of them. And that when you have that, you have the loss of a civilization. You have the loss of you have really the crystallization and incapacity to go on. But eventually, things change too over time, but they also go along with other transformations that naturally are not merely intellectual, right? They actually have to do also with the availability of wealth, and how, also production of how property is possessed. But this is something that we will see in completely different situations. Now, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.